and then turn it over to Dr. Lechner to introduce himself and kick us off.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is, as Shauna mentioned, my name is Zach Lechner. Please call me Zach. I'm the Historic Preservation Officer for the City of Tempe, also Senior Planner for the city. So in the Planning Department. So the discussion that we're having today is pertaining to some proposed updates to the Historic Preservation ordinance. So I'm just going to be going over a few highlights and just leaving plenty of time for questions and comments. So I appreciate you all being here, and so thank you for that. So let's go ahead and get things going here. Okay, so the historic preservation ordinance. So this is again the document we're referring to. This is the document that's going to have the proposed changes. It's also known as Chapter 14A of the City Code. So this is, municipal law. It was adopted in November of 1995, so some time ago. And if you have had a chance to review the historic preservation ordinance online, you will notice at the end of various sections that there's a lot of sometimes more than in some sections more than others. There's a series of dates, and those are the dates of revision. And so this ordinance has been, as you would expect, over the last 28 years, there has been cause to revise it. And so now we're at kind of another one of those points where it was felt by the Planning Department, the Historic Preservation Office, that we just needed to institute some revisions to the ordinance, just for the purposes of historic preservation, for the purpose of clarity, etc. So these are the sections here. If you see on the right side of the slide there, under Chapter 14A, Historic Preservation, that refers to the sections of the Historic Preservation Ordinance. So there's a whole kind of variety of sections, some just laying out kind of definitions, some pertaining to the establishment and the operations of the Historic Preservation Commission and the Historic Preservation Officer, who serves as the staff liaison for the Historic Preservation Commission, as well as various guidelines related to historic properties in the city, demolition and removal of those properties, maintaining and repairing those properties. And then there's also a violations section. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a few moments. All right, so I want to also mention to you bring up the historic preservation plan, and the reason for that is because the historic preservation plan is really kind of a big reason that we're here today, because there's a series of priorities that were included in the plan that essentially direct the community development department, and specifically the Historic Preservation Office, which is within the Community Development Department, the Planning Division specifically, to make or to propose some changes to the ordinance. So there's probably half a dozen or so priorities that relate to updates in the ordinance, and some of those are, I would argue, are probably the most important ones. And I'll be noting which ones are coming out of the historic preservation plan priorities when I go over the highlights here in just a few moments. But the original historic preservation plan was adopted back in November of '95, and then the revised version, which is a much expanded, much more kind of robust document, was adopted by City Council in June of '22. So it's just been on the books for a little over a year now. So the purpose of the proposed updates is, one, as I mentioned, to just fulfill a series of priorities in the historic preservation plan adopted last year. Also to clarify just some requirements and procedures, for example, to align, certain procedures laid out in the zoning and development code with procedures in the historic preservation ordinance, to kind of make sure that we're carrying out procedures in the same way, across different departments in the city. So just kind of aligning requirements and expectations, in particular for zoning map amendments, which I'll talk briefly about here, as they have a role to play in the historic property designation process. And then the third reason for the proposed updates is just kind of minor textual changes, which are not, in and of themselves, highly significant, but just as a kind of a way to kind of clean up the document a bit, maybe even correct a typo, here or there, those kinds of things. So the key changes in the first four that I'm laying out, and pretty much I would say almost all of these, even kind of the sub points under clarifying various procedures there at the bottom of the slide, come from the HP plan, the Historic Preservation Plan. So the first change has to do with increasing the maximum length of stays on issuing demolition permits for historic properties from 6 months or 180 days to 365 days, on historic eligible properties from 30 days to 60 days, and then imposing a maximum stay of 60 days on issuance of a demolition permit for all properties 50 years or older. And you might ask yourself, well, why 50 years? That seems kind of arbitrary. Well, the reason that we have 50 years or older here is because the National Park Service and their National Register of Historic Places program, that's what they set as kind of the cutoff for being able to consider a property historic. Now, that doesn't mean that every property over the age of 50 years is historic. There are, many other factors that go into determining what's referred to in the historic preservation field as historic integrity. And so just because a property is 50 years or older doesn't mean it's going to meet, all those necessary kind of metrics. So this is just designed as a way to kind of further, insulate properties from demolition, to protect the historic built environment, which there's been a lot of buildings in Tempe over the years, as there has been in other communities as well, that have been demolished. And so, one of the interests of the Historic Preservation Office, and I would say this, the city in general, of course, is to, as best we can within our rapidly, kind of developing city, particularly our downtown, to preserve those extant historic structures as best we can. So this is just a tool to do that. Now, it doesn't mean that, for every property, necessarily that, automatically the Historic Preservation Office is going to, slap on a stay of demolition. For one thing, for historic properties, and that means properties that are listed or designated in the local registers, that's called the Tempe Historic Property Register. That has to be, that decision to impose that stay comes from an action of the Historic Preservation Commission. They have to deny the demolition permit request, and then at that point, the stay of up to 365 days can occur. That would be if these proposed changes were imposed. Currently, as I said, it's a 180-day stay. With historic eligible properties, historic eligible just means a property that the Historic Preservation Commission has classified as being eligible for the local register, but is not actually designated in the local register. Those decisions are made in terms of whether or not to put a stay of demolition and how long on a demolition permit by the Historic Preservation Officer. So again, me. And so, with the 60-day stay on demolition permits for all properties 50 years or older, that, we don't really, that's kind of a change in the sense that, we don't have kind of protective provisions in place in the ordinance currently for properties that are 50 years or older. So that is, a bit of a change. And I know that, some folks might have a concern of like, oh, well, I want to demolish my house, and my house is, from 1970, and it's a maybe it's or let's say it's from 1960. It's it's clearly over the 50-year-old threshold. At plus, and it's just a post-war ranch home. There's nothing terribly significant about it in and of itself. It's not part of a larger historic district. Is the HPO just going to kind of arbitrarily prevent me from demolishing my house for 60 days just because they can? And I would say the answer is no. So, the 60 days is a maximum that can be imposed. And the reason for that is, in this case, I would want to have the opportunity to kind of investigate the property a little bit, just do a little bit of analysis and determine, if this is a property that might have some historic value. Maybe it's a property that could potentially be, designated in the local register. And if that's the case, then we want to use that time to maybe talk with the homeowner and see if there's some opportunities to potentially avoid demolition, and perhaps even designate the property. Now, at the end of that, whatever the length of stay of the demolition happens to be, if the property owner decides, no, I still wish to, demolish the property, and this goes for commercial properties as well, they still have the absolute right and authority to do that. So this does not, permanently prevent anybody from demolishing a property. It just kind of gives a little bit of a cooling off period, and investigation period is probably a better way to put it, to kind of investigate these properties. So for most homes, that are, say, built 50 years or more ago, it's not going to be that difficult for me to pretty quickly investigate the home, take a look. And I'm not saying I have to go to your home or anything. I'm just saying, look at the property, the kind of the records, and make a pretty quick determination of whether this is, has some historic potential. So I would say the vast majority of the time that a demolition request comes in for, let's say, an individual home in a neighborhood, I'm going to be able to kind of figure out, whether we're going to have an extended stay on that demolition pretty quickly. And I think that's going to be very rare that actually happens. If at the most, probably your demolition permit is going to be delayed by, maybe a day or two. So nothing too onerous. Okay, so I'm happy to answer more questions about that. But I want to move on to the next one, the next key change, which is to revise and clarify information in the violations section of the ordinance. If you've had a chance to take a look at the proposed changes in the markups document on the website, you'll see there's a kind of basically the violation section has been deleted, and we've kind of just like started over with that, because that section was pretty brief. It really kind of needed more specifics, and we've really kind of chosen to focus more on civil violations, or civil punishments, and kind of generally take kind of criminal punishments out of the equation. So anyway, I'm happy to answer more questions about that, but I'll move on to the third point here, and that has to do with essentially encouraging people to designate a property in the Tempe Historic Property Register. One potential deterrent to doing that for some folks might be the fact that they have to pay application fees currently to do that. We have in the past, in the recent past, have just kind of chosen to, at the planning division and community development department, more largely, have just decided to kind of informally waive those application fees. But we felt it was important to kind of put that into the code, write that into the code, so that would just be kind of a standard procedure moving forward, because we just we want to make it not more difficult for people to designate their properties, but rather easier where we can. The fourth key change that I'll mention has to do with expanding the definition of archaeologically sensitive. So this is yet another priority that's listed in the Historic Preservation Plan of 2022. Under current code, archaeologically sensitive is defined in city code as a property that is physically located within a in the Arizona State Museum designated archaeological site, whether it's prehistoric or historic. Um, Now, under this new proposed definition, which comes directly from a language change in the historic preservation plan, archaeologically sensitive would include the old definition, so within an ASM designated archaeological site. And then it would also include properties that are within 250 feet of an archaeological site, within 50 feet, or intersected by a prehistoric or historic canal. And then also properties that are considered of kind of cultural importance to tribal nations. Now, archaeologically sensitive, I want to make clear, again, it doesn't impinge on your property rights. So as let's say as in like in the case of like an individual homeowner. So Arizona state law, does have for projects that occur on private land. Okay, there are some archaeological requirements, but only as it pertains to to encounters with human remains. Okay, so if, for example, you're doing a project in your backyard, okay, and you're digging in your backyard, you've checked with the city, and you know where all the lines are, the gas lines and all that stuff. You've done your due diligence, and you're digging, and let's say, holy smokes, I encountered some type of burial, or something that I've been able to identify as a burial. You are obligated by law to get in touch with the Arizona State Museum, and then they will kind of assist you with the process moving forward. Very unlikely that will happen, and it's not an onerous process, but nevertheless you're required to do that. You're not required to do anything beyond that. Okay, so when I say archaeologically sensitive, I don't want folks to think like, oh no, now I've got to that really is going to place a lot of restrictions on my properties. Really, where this comes into play has to do with projects that are carried out by the city of Tempe and that occur on city of Tempe land. Okay, so it's really mainly this definition is important when it comes to the actions of the city, not to actions of private individuals. But again, I can offer further clarification on that if you'd like. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight a few kind of clarifying, or I want to kind of clarify some various procedures that are laid out in the revised updates, or the proposed updates. One of them has to do with aligning notification requirements in the Historic Preservation Ordinance with those in the Zoning Development Code. And I kind of teased this one earlier. So when a person is looking to designate their property in the local register, the mechanism by which that is done is actually a zoning map amendment. So what the zoning map amendment does in that case is it, if approved ultimately by City Council, it places a historic overlay on top of not just the building itself, but the actual parcel, the whole parcel on which the building or the structure sits. And so there was a little bit of a disconnect between the process that's currently laid out in the Historic Preservation Ordinance versus what is required through the Zoning Development Code. And we in the Historic Preservation Office have been still kind of following the procedures, the requirements in the Zoning Development Code, but we just want to make sure that it's written kind of correctly into the Historic Preservation Ordinance, just to ensure there's no kind of confusion going down the line. So just again, that's just a procedural thing, and then the second one has to do with aligning language related to filing protests against a proposed historic district with procedures mandated in ARS 9-462.04H. That is a piece of legislation that does a whole variety of things, but that particular section of that legislation essentially says this, and actually, why don't I believe I have it pulled up, so let me share it with you rather than try to kind of fumble my way through talking about it. So bear with me for just 1 second. Let's see. Well, I may have it pulled up, I may not. Okay, but let me not waste your time with trying to figure that out. Okay. So what I can tell you though is that this legislation has to do with designating historic districts. So a historic district is a collection of what are referred to as contributing properties. Okay, so that would be like Date Palm Manor neighborhood is a historic neighborhood. It's designated as a district in the Tempe Historic Property Register and also incidentally in the National Register of Historic Places. And so let's say, the members of another historic neighborhood are looking to kind of get together and, the vast majority of them are in support of designating their neighborhood as a historic district. But within that community, at least 20% or more of the owners of houses or lots or parcels, they object to that and they file a formal objection to it. Then doesn't mean that the process will stop. What it means is that once the matter makes it to city council is required to if in order to approve that historic district, it's required to have a super majority vote of approval. So 75% of or more of the city council has to approve that. So not just a simple majority will suffice to approve a historic district when 20% or more of the property owners within that district object. Okay. So see, I didn't need the help there. So, and then finally, just one last thing. Again, just a very just kind of dry procedural issue. The proposal here is to allow the Historic Preservation Office, in consultation with the city clerk's office, to stagger new incoming historic preservation commissioners or commission members' terms when we have a situation where more than two commissioners are rotating off of the commission at any given time. This is not an HP plan priority, but it's just kind of something that came up recently because earlier this year we had 3 members of the commission rotate off, and it's a little bit of an issue, a little bit of concern because it's a 9-member commission, and so when you have 3 people rotate off, I mean that's a third of your commission that leaves, and so you're kind of losing quite a bit of institutional knowledge, and it's just for continuity's sake, it's better if you have I would argue if you have fewer people leaving the commission at any given time. So that would just kind of empower HPO, Historic Preservation Officer, and City Clerk just to kind of make those those terms, which are normally 3-year terms, say make one incoming member's term a 1-year term, a 2-year term, a 3-year term, just so that we can then kind of align things, and so no more than 2 members is rotating off at any one time. Now, again, I wanted to stress that these are proposed changes. Okay, so one thing that's going to potentially influence what ultimately will make its way through kind of the public meeting process and make its way through council will be certainly your comments, your feedback, and also very importantly will be reviewed by the city attorney's office. So these proposed changes are kind of currently in the review process by the city attorney's office, and so the language could always change. There always could be certain proposed changes that are removed, or I mean perhaps added as a result of the city attorney's office's feedback. So I just want to make that clear. There's obviously a legal rendering of a legal opinion here by the city attorney's office, which is of course critical because these will be, if they are adopted by council, part of the ordinance, part of the historic preservation ordinance and city code. So we got to make sure we're on legally strong ground in that case. All right. I just want to kind of wind down here before we kind of get to your questions and comments with the kind of past, current, and upcoming public meeting and outreach schedule. So a couple of, I guess it's been almost 2 weeks now, 2 weeks tomorrow, that the Historic Preservation Commission had an initial discussion of these proposed updates to the Historic Preservation Ordinance. I presented that information to them, got a little bit of feedback from them. Today, we have our public information meeting. We have this meeting with you all virtually today at noon, and then we'll have another meeting in person this evening at 6 p.m. At the library at the intersection of rural and southern. So come on back if you are a glutton for punishment. And then October 4th, I'll be presenting to the Neighborhood Advisory Commission just an informational presentation soliciting their feedback as well. And then starting today, and Shauna will add a little bit more information to this, and I believe she's included in the chat the link to the survey that we've put together. Really, Shauna, I'll say, has put together for you all to provide input on these proposed changes. So please do just takes just really just a couple of minutes, a few minutes, however much time you have to fill out that survey or comment form, whatever you want to call it, and it's available there at the website provided, and also in the chat. So I would just go to the chat, and you could probably click the link directly. So that will be open until October 9th. So submit it early, and not often, but just once. But submit it as soon as you can, just to make sure you get that done. We'd greatly appreciate it. November 8th, the HPC will have kind of the formal review of these proposed updates. The Historic Preservation Office and the Planning Division will be requesting a recommendation of adoption of these updates. And then that will be followed by 2 city council meetings. So it goes from HPC to city council. The November 30th meeting is the first hearing by council, just the introduction of the request. And then December 21st, council will meet for its second hearing on this item, and it will actually be asked to make a decision on whether or not to adopt these updates. Okay, so this is my contact information. So feel free to take that down, or you can just Google Historic Preservation Officer or Zach Lechner, City of Tempe, and this information will come up for you. Certainly feel free to call me or email me, whatever you prefer. Sometimes it works out, I'm just able to respond to email a little bit more quickly. But that's all I have for you, just in terms of a presentation. And so, Sean, did you want to add anything before we kind of move on to questions and comments?
No, just as Zach had said, I put in the chat the link for public comments, the link to the website where that schedule, any updated markups, links to agendas, all of that information will be posted. So if you want to keep up to date and follow it along in the process, you can always go there as a good resource. Mm-hmm. And so then from there, Zach, I'll go through the questions.
Okay.
The first one is asking for properties 50 years or older. They're estimating that's 25% of all built property in Tempe.
Right.
So that's kind of in a question mark. And 50% of our properties 10 years from now. Do you know for properties, how many are 50 years or older, the housing stock?
I don't. I mean, I wouldn't dispute that number, but I don't have that. But I also don't have, the actual stats at at the tips of my fingers. I mean, I think, yeah, I think there might be some folks who might say, well, that's a lot of properties. Like, how are you going to manage all that? But then again, demolitions of properties are not, uncommon. But it's not as if we're, getting just like scores and scores of demolition requests on a daily basis. So I don't see that as an issue, in terms of, preventing me from, making pretty quick, um, analyses of the properties and quickly, allowing those vast majority of the time, I'm expecting those demolition permits to go ahead and, just kind of go through without considerable delay. So, if you have a property that's 50 years or older, and you're anxious to demolish it, I don't think that you're gonna typically encounter a problem. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if we're talking about pre-World War II housing stock, that's which we have a very limited amount of in the city. I mean, that's obviously something that bears more scrutiny when, we're looking at, potential demolition requests. But if we're talking about the vast majority of properties which are of a kind of a post-war, age, post-World War II age, those are generally, not particularly distinctive architecturally. So unless there's some type of, kind of important historic person who's associated with the building, with the house, or it was, somehow linked to some larger historical event, usually it's not going to meet the requirements for a property to be considered historic, under the city code or under the, provisions of the National Register of Historic Places, which the city code and the Historic Preservation Ordinance closely follows. So, yeah, I would say that, yeah, that's not I'm not too concerned about that, even though, yeah, when you say that, I'm like, well, that's a lot of houses, and I'm sure you're right about that. But, again, demolition is, again, I don't foresee us getting overwhelmed by that process. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the next question asks if it's true in the state of Arizona, nationally registered historic properties get a property tax cut. And then the question is if we should be encouraging that.
I missed the first part of that question. Can you say that again,
Yeah.
Sean? I'm sorry.
Is it true that in the state of Arizona, nationally registered historic properties get property tax cuts?
It is, but usually it's generally for, kind of income producing properties. So it would be, normally it's for, say, commercial properties that are, maybe they're engaging in adaptive reuse or something along those lines. So, currently there isn't a lot, unfortunately, um, of help for kind of property owners, individual property owners, homeowners, I should say. Now, one thing we are doing in the city of Tempe is we have kind of gotten approval as part of our capital improvements, program process, over the next several years to begin, laying out, a program to, and we haven't kind of established the parameters of it yet, so I don't want to, kind of, speak in too much detail about it. But what essentially, the idea is to provide some assistance, for people whose homes are probably either designated or at least eligible for designation in the local register, to receive some assistance, probably as a kind of a matching basis to help restore those, or rehabilitate those properties. Yeah, so that's we have thought about that, and it's something we definitely do want to encourage in the city, and, we're trying to kind of actualize that, moving forward. Though it will be several years before you might actually see that program rolled out.
Okay, and then the next question is asking where are the historic canals? Jana Lynn, I'm assuming that's what you mean by HX, unless that means something else.
Well, they're everywhere, and you might be standing on top of one right now. So that that's the thing. There's a lot of historic canals that are above ground, and you see those, throughout the city. It's one of the things that I had to get used to when I moved to the Southwest. Is like, wow, there's just canal with water flowing everywhere. But most canals that I'm talking about, are, going to be subterranean. And so the way that we know about those is, or the way that we think we might know about those is through some projections that were created by some archaeologists, almost about 35 years ago. There's a very detailed map. And so that's what we use, to kind of project where those canals are likely to be. And so when I say, the archaeologically sensitive category will include properties that are intersected by or within 50 feet of a projected canal. That's the map that we're using. So that map is is considered kind of culturally sensitive. So it's not a public resource, that we make available. But it's certainly something that I, am privy to and can analyze. And so, that's where the basis of our archaeologically sensitive category for canals comes from.
Okay, thank you. And for the things in the chat, if there are comments, we will make sure those are going to all be included in the public input summary. I'm going to go through the questions right now so that we can make sure we get the answers, but please note if you put comments, those will be included, as well as we encourage you to fill out the survey. Everything you put in there is also then provided as any proposed changes move through the public process. So, and Nicole, also feel free to come off mute because I'm going to try to capture what you're asking, but I know sometimes, okay, the question comes up like as Zach was speaking. So hopefully it still makes sense when I read it, Zach, because it's probably in response to some of your presentation.
Oh, sure.
But this is talking about the burial law and that AAA does not apply to private when there is no federal monies involved. And there is no cultural significance for structures built in the 70s or later. So why is the city allocating time towards this and taking up taxpayer resources to entertain these changes that really are not necessary?
Well, again, as I said, you're absolutely right. You say the AAA and you're referring to the Arizona Antiquities Act, which governs kind of requirements for archaeological mitigation for projects that are kind of carried out by the state or instruments of the state, which would include a municipality like Tempe. So why are we including in the plan? Well, because a lot of the work that I do on a daily basis is consulting with other city departments who are carrying out projects, ground disturbing projects in the city of Tempe. It might be a transportation project, it might be a parks and recreation project. And so, we, the city, as a instrument of the state, we are required to abide by the Arizona Antiquities Act, and of course we do. But we also want to kind of go beyond those requirements because we are the stewards of ancestral lands, in particular. And so we want to ensure that we're protecting those properties as best we can, and as robustly as we can. In regard to the comment, there's no cultural significance for structures built in the 70s or later. Well, I appreciate your view on that. The National Register and the National Park Service would and the historic preservation community would have a slightly different view. I mean, I was born at the tail end of the 70s, so I know that the 70s can kind of seem like a cultural wasteland sometimes at times, right? Just in pop culture. But I will say though that that when those post-war ranch houses were coming of age, the kind of the gut level reaction was like, man, like what is significant about the post-war ranch house? It's like it's a box, like it's boring, like there's nothing here that's valid. And so I know folks will have said the same thing about the split level design of the 1970s, and I'm not saying that there's no merit to that, but I'm just saying that based on the way that the National Park Service defines historic, it's really just it's an issue of age. So kind of by definition, anything that from 1973 or older is now considered potentially historic. Doesn't mean that it is. Again, like I said before and during my presentation, there's a whole host of factors that go into whether something is going to be considered historic. However, just in terms of age, which is kind of like the minimum threshold, right? Or kind of you got to cross that threshold before you can be considered for some of the other aspects of potential historic significance. That's really kind of the main thing that kind of gets you in the door. Yeah, but again, for like individual properties that are particularly have no architectural significance or are not associated with historic persons or important historic events, those aren't considered historic. So whether they're from 1972 or they're from 1900, they're not they're not going to be eligible for any type of historic designation. Yep. Sean, I think you're muted. No, Shauna, I think you're muted.
I muted myself as I'm asking Nicole to come off mute. Yeah, Nicole has her hand raised, Zach, and she had asked that
Okay.
question. So, Nicole, if you want to clarify or ask anything else.
Yeah, Shauna, thank you. And thanks, Zach, for this, or Zachary. I'm actually in two different meetings right now, so I'm catching bits and pieces. So I apologize if my clarification and my question, if you already kind of addressed this. But I mean, you did just mention ancestral lands, which we know doesn't really apply to these proposed changes, right? My concern is really finding out what the intent is of, I know we want to be in alignment, I've heard, with state feds and what their recommendations are, but where is it really pertinent in going through this process that it's necessary? And that's why I keep bringing up the mass development of the 70s. I mean, that was where we just really went crazy with our urban sprawl, right? So I don't see that is probably the best business practice for Tempe to take on, because 50 years, well, we're going to get into the mid 70s and late 70s. When do we finally put have some thresholds there where we kind of make ourselves think about what we're including in the 50 years, right? So partly that's what my intent is myself in asking these questions. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll just say, I mean, what's considered historic, it always changes, right? So, I mean, so let's say we're Americans in, you know, 1800. Well, for them, the 1790s was not historic, because it had just happened, or the American Revolution was barely historic because it had just ended, what, 7 years earlier. So it's all relative, So I think that's one thing. So I know kind of now, like looking back from the perspective of where we are, and sometimes depending on your age, right? Because I know, like, like I said, I was born at the tail end of the 70s. So like in some ways it still feels like it's like the early 2000s to me. So like, so like when, anything before that within my lifespan, just feels like, well, yeah, it's not, I mean, that just happened. I experienced that. How can that be historic? But yeah, I mean, so history, what we consider historic does change over time, as the years add up. So I know it may not seem right now, like when you're just at like the threshold of something becoming eligible to become historic, like something from the early to mid 70s, you might think to yourselves like, yeah, I just don't see that as, as historic in any way, or I don't see this particular design because I don't like it, or because it's ugly, or because it just, seems to kind of lacking in whatever ornamentation or what have you. So I definitely understand that thinking. But we're going just kind of based on we have to have a standard, and so the standard that kind of all historic preservation officials go on is this kind of this 50-year threshold. And again, it doesn't require us to then automatically start designate every house or every gas station from 1973 and putting it in the local register. I mean, that would be a terrible idea, and would make no sense, and would completely degrade the meaning of what is historic and not. The idea is, again, to really kind of focus on those properties that meet not just the age requirement, but meet there's like 7 factors that the National Register requires for, a property to be considered historic. It's like it has to be in its proper setting. It has to be able to essentially communicate the history that once took place there in some manner. It can't have been changed a whole lot, architecturally, so that it, bears no kind of, semblance of its original appearance. And so I hear what you're saying, but we'll kind of continue to use that age requirement just as a standard in which we can then make more kind of informed evaluations of whether the property in question, or the series of properties, if we're talking about a historic district, may in fact be considered or eligible to be considered historic. And there's always going to be disagreement about that. If there wasn't, it wouldn't be interesting, I suppose. But we'll continue to use that because it's kind of the best measure that we have.
And then Ryan did answer in the chat a question about the timeline, but just for everyone's benefit, what Zach does is, and our planning staff take the comments we received during the survey, any comments during the meetings, and we'll go back to the Historic Preservation Commission for some final recommendations. And when City Council hears it, the first hearing is just that, a hearing. You can still come, provide your own comments. They'll get a presentation. There's no actual action until the second hearing. So the city code does require holding both those hearings with council, where the first one is just to hear it, and then the second one is the actual action. And so if you're following it along, just so you know, that would be the final vote.
Yeah, and you can actually, you can feel free to comment at the first hearing, the second hearing of council. You can
commission
also
meetings.
at the neighborhood commission meeting coming up in early October, at the Historic Preservation Commission meeting or hearing on this particular item. So there's ample opportunity besides just now and with the survey to make your voice heard. So I just want to make that clear.
Okay, so here's a question that says neighborhood preservation looks at the collective. How does the plan address the collective?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, in some ways, like kind of setting a standard for kind of all properties, I think, helps to do that. In terms of neighborhoods, I mean, certainly one of the things we do in the Historic Preservation Office is to encourage, folks to designate their properties, and to, try to make clear some of the, the benefits of preserving a historic property. And I think the argument is sometimes even stronger for a historic neighborhood, because it's not just, an individual home or individual history, but it's a whole collection of homes. And I think if you look around at some of the historic neighborhoods in the city, I mean, there's like there's a sense of identity that's been, kind of maintained in those neighborhoods, as well as a sense of history. So, although I know it can be challenging sometimes, because usually it takes a person or a collection of people to kind of spearhead the effort to designate a neighborhood as historic. And it can seem kind of daunting because there's a whole kind of series of meetings that, public meetings that, you have to go through, and there's a whole process to it. I think, ultimately, like, we do encourage that process here in the city, because, we recognize the importance of neighborhoods, and, not just in, keeping them, I guess, whole, but also keeping their kind of sense of historical perspective, because I think it helps to kind of lend a certain kind of feeling of pride that one has and where one lives, and then also just kind of recognizing, that, hey, I live in kind of a historic place. It kind of connects you with those in the past, which I think is just kind of a larger, effort of historic preservation. So, we're certainly, the plan itself, the historic preservation plan, and the code, changes, or the text amendments, as we sometimes call them, are designed to, encourage that kind of, keeping those neighborhoods, that sense of identity and historical identity together through the process of designation. So if you're interested, if you live in a neighborhood that's, of a certain age, it's older than 1973 or 73 or older, and you're interested in talking to me about, maybe trying to get that neighborhood or a portion of the neighborhood designated as a district, certainly, something I'd be interested in talking to you about.
Okay, and Eric, you had a question next?
Yep, thank you, Shauna. Zach, thank you for doing this. Really appreciate you explaining
Sure.
things in greater detail. I represent the Tempe Chamber of Commerce. This has caught the attention of the business community, so we're looking at things through the lens of what's the impact on commercial and industrial property. My question to you is, has staff done a Prop 207 scrub on this as to whether it triggers the regulatory taking, or does that come later in the legal review of what you're proposing?
Well, I mean, certainly, yeah. I mean, certainly, Prop 207 is always a bears scrutiny. Whenever we're talking about kind of these types of measures, certainly the city attorney's office is well aware of that law, and will be kind of advising us based on their interpretation of that. I mean, is there something you said it caught the attention of the community? Is there a certain aspect of the changes that you stand out to you, or that you have a special concern with?
We've asked for feedback at this point in our process, and we'll be happy to provide you that with you.
Yeah.
This seems to be a significant change in things. It's taking the power that's within the purview of the council and sending it to the Historic Preservation Office. The Prop 207 issue is going to have to be answered from the perspective of the business community, because that impacts all of us, regardless of what we're trying to do here. So more to come, but that was just some feedback we received initially after the first time review.
Is there something specific that you're looking at when you see the I think it's the way you termed it, essentially council being disempowered in favor of the HPO, the Historic Preservation Office?
Well, if the Historic Preservation Office has to take a look at any property that's 50 years old, you may be able to do that rather quickly. And while you're an intelligent, good-natured person, you're going to have a successor at some point in time that may have ulterior motives. So, from a business community perspective, we've got to take best case and worst case scenario into consideration as you look at changes in code.
Sure. Yeah, and I will say, just as part of clarification, yeah, if the demolition permit, it cannot be denied permanently. So at the most, as I said, it would be a 60-day stay of demolition, just like there's a 30-day stay of demolition on historic eligible properties currently. And so at the end of those 60 days, under the proposed changes, if they go through, then if the property owner decides, yeah, I still want to, and the stay of 60 days is imposed, the full stay. At the end of that, if the property owner decides, yeah, I want to go through with it, then they will absolutely, they'll receive the demolition permit on the 61st day, and things will proceed as is. So.
And thank you for that. And Zach, if you're amenable, we may ask you to come talk to the Chamber's Government Relations Committee to provide a little more background on this and what you're trying to do, and explain things far better than I ever could to them.
Sure. I'd be happy to. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are getting close to the end of our hour. Did anyone have any last questions? Otherwise, we'll let Zach wrap it up. And as mentioned before, you've got all the links there in the chat, or we will be at the library again this evening. Yes, Nicole.
Yeah, thank you. And I know it's in the chat, but briefly, if we have a few minutes, Zachary, if you could explain why the doubling of the time framed with 30 to 60, and then as well for the properties that are already registered. What's the intent behind that? Yeah,
so I would say with the and I'll leave out the one for properties that are 50 years or older, because that is a new one. I will say that with it, properties that are historic eligible. So as you're mentioning, currently under code, there's a maximum of a 30-day stay of demolition, a 30-day stay that the Historic Preservation Office can impose on a demolition permit request. So the reasoning behind that is so that the Historic Preservation Officer and also the Historic Preservation Commission can kind of, weigh in, reach out to the property owner, and whether applicant and property owner, whether they choose to engage is totally up to them. And just, kind of see if there might be some alternatives that can be worked out to demolishing a historic property. Because, obviously the Historic Preservation Office, Historic Preservation Commission, it's got historic preservation in the name. So that's kind of their mandate, is to try to preserve and encourage, historic preservation. And so what we found is that, when you only have 30 days, it's not a lot of time, particularly if the Historic Preservation Officer wishes to solicit feedback from the Historic Preservation Commission, which meets only monthly. And sometimes it doesn't, meet in a given month if there's no, kind of pressing agenda items. So it's just to give a little bit more time for that consultation process. Secondly, I think you had also asked about kind of doubling it from kind of the current for designated properties. So those properties already listed in the historic property register, the local register, doubling the potential stay on a demolition permit from 6 months to a year. Yeah, I mean, it is, again, it's kind of for similar reasons. I mean, I think also as a way to just more broadly encourage historic preservation. And then, we looked around at some other municipalities, City of Phoenix, for example, and just realized there's a green light that seems to be flashing behind me, which I've never been able to identify in my office, so I apologize for that. But regardless, looked around at the City of Phoenix, and the City of Phoenix, they actually have a 1-year stay of demolition on historic properties, designated properties. And so, we thought it reasonable to kind of align ourselves with that, kind of lengthier stay period, particularly for designated properties. Phoenix actually goes beyond that a little bit, and it has another category for landmarks, which it considers kind of properties that are, really historically significant. So like really vital to the historic, landscape, the built landscape of the city. And so if we were doing that, and if we were proposing that in Tempe, which we're not, if the equivalent would be like Hayden House, right? Or La Casa Villa. It's probably the most important historic property. I mean, that would definitely be a landmark, so if we were applying Phoenix's, approach, we would be asking, council to approve up to a 3-year stay of demolition on a building like that. Well, we're not. So we're taking kind of like a middle ground position and extending the stay to a year. So again, encourages preservation. Again, encourages alternatives, because obviously if a developer has a whole project in place, and they're looking to demolish a property, it may and they have the inclination, it may take some time for them to kind of revise their plans. I also want to mention too, if the Historic Preservation Commission, and this is in current city code, and this will remain the same, this will remain unchanged. If a applicant has a demolition permit denied by the Historic Preservation Commission, which would then kick in that currently 6-month, and if approved with these changes, 1 year, 365-day stay, they do have the ability to appeal that decision directly to City Council. And if City Council decides to reverse that decision, to overturn that decision of the Historic Preservation Commission, then the demolition permit can proceed without continuing, without following through to that full stay of demolition. So there is kind of an appeals process I want to mention as well, that is currently in the code, and it will continue to be there.
Okay, Chuck, if you have a quick question, we can take it.
There, now you can hear me.
There you are. Yes.
All right. Thanks, Shauna. I'll make it real quick. I was just going to say I was on the Historic Commission for 8 years, and there were 2 cases that came before us. I think it was called the First Congregational Church, which is right next to Tempe City Hall. This supports what Zach was saying, that these cases can take a lot of time to resolve. In the case of that church, the congregation wasn't using the church and they wanted to sell it to a developer to build a high-rise apartment building. In that case, 30 days was not really enough. Ultimately, the property owner got what he wanted, and he's allowed to tear down the church if he wishes. And the second case I was going to mention was a house on Mill Avenue next to the Tempe Women's Club. And in this case, the owner wanted to sell and as he said, maximize huge value in the land with no regard for the historic house on it. In that case, the commission, mostly the historic preservation officer at the time, and other city staff and community development worked with the owner, and it took more than 30 days. I can tell you that it took several months, but everybody got what they wanted. The homeowner got to sell his property with the knowledge that he was now being granted additional development rights to the back half of the property. He agreed to preserve the historic house in the front as long as a second house was allowed to be built at the back of the property, and that helped him maximize the value he saw in the land. And the city got to preserve the house. So in that case, it was a win-win, but as Zach was saying, it can take a lot of time. And that was a great example. Took several months. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. Yeah, and actually that with that property, the Butler House, 1220 South Mill Avenue, that's a designated property, so it actually had would have been a 6-month stay of demolition on it, and that whole process. I mean, it took more than 30 days, and I think it ultimately took more than 6 months from the time that kind of an agreement was reached, and the facade conservation easement was approved, and there was a lot split approved by city council. And so it was quite a negotiation process, and we were grateful to the homeowner that they were amenable to that. But having that extra time to kind of work out something, a resolution that was mutually beneficial to the property owner and then also to the city was really, really helpful, and we probably couldn't have done it without it.
So we thank you all for joining us today. As I mentioned, this recording will also be online, or we will welcome you at the library tonight. So Zach, did you have anything else to wrap us up?
I just want to say thank you for all your questions and for all the feedback you provided and any feedback that you'll provide in the survey. So I really am grateful for the time you've taken. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.